Good evening. Welcome to you all. Am I the only one who's soaked? Are you looking forward to this anyway, even if you're soaked? Good, so am I. Thank you. My name is Tracy Metz. I'm the director of the John Adams Institute, and I want to welcome you to the opening of our new fall season. And our first speaker this evening is Rachel Aviv. And we're delighted to, first speaker of this season, not of this evening. And we're delighted to have her here in collaboration with the publishing house Atlas Contact, and also together with our sponsor, the company Wolters Kluwer, which has been with us now for many years. It is a pleasure working with them. And we're delighted to welcome them and many colleagues of Wolters Kluwer here to the audience this evening. Thank you for supporting us. Thank you for believing in us and making this all possible. It's a very happy collaboration, and I hope we'll be doing this for a long time to come. I also wanted to give a special word of welcome to two people. I don't know if they're here. Those are the translators of Rachel's book, Strangers to Ourselves, Jan Willem Reitsma and Albert Witteveen. Are you here? What an anticlimax. I'm so sorry. The translators of Rachel's book into Dutch are Jan Willem Reitsma and Albert Witteveen. And if you ever run into them, tell them that they missed their moment of glory. I thought Rachel's book was just wonderful. It is such an impressive combination of private experience, journalistic research, empathy, and pulling this all together into such a powerful narrative that even when it's about cultures you don't know, people you don't know, all of this really hits home. It really hits you between the eyes, and it's also just beautifully written. So, Rachel, thank you for writing this wonderful book. And I must say, I don't know when you started working on this. Maybe that will come up in the conversation this evening, but it is, of course, so timely and so relevant after the pandemic, when so many people, especially young people, are struggling with mental health issues of their own. So I think in that sense, the timing couldn't have been better, and I know that that's why so many people have embraced this book as also as a source of solace, that they're not alone, and that so much of how we approach mental illness is tied to our culture, tied to issues, for example, of racism. And Rachel says in her introduction to the book that she wanted to present a diversity of experiences of mental illness. And she presented a diversity that I myself had never even thought about. So for me personally, it was a real eye-opener. And she says, this book is about missing stories, the facets of identity that our theories of the mind fail to capture. So it's about the profession of dealing with mental illness and also the personal experiences of people confronted with that profession and its inadequacies, shall I say. Good intentions, but inadequacies. It's a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, I hope that after our gathering this evening, you'll buy it in Dutch if you do read Dutch, because we are delighted that Atlas Contact has translated the book, and we hope that publishers like Atlas Contact can continue to translate books like this. And they can only do that if Dutch speakers buy the Dutch copy. Enjoy the conversation. I will now hand over the floor to this evening's moderator, Els Kwagebuur. Els will give an introduction and then talk with Rachel. Then there'll be a conversation where they'll be joined by Lena Brill. And then there'll be time for questions from you. Do keep them to the point. Make sure that your questions end with a question mark. And enjoy the evening. Thanks for being here.
Hi. Excuses for my hair. It's the rain. Is this not a double sound from here and from here? No. Everything okay? In my first apartment in Amsterdam, after leaving student housing, I had a neighbor called Teddy. His actual name was Freddy, but he wanted to be called Teddy after he watched the horror movie Nightmare on Elm Street, starring Freddy Krueger. His favorite teacher in kindergarten, also called Freddy, fell to her death when she was standing on a ladder to clean out her gutters. That too was a reason. Growing up, Teddy and his single mother, Francine, his father left them before Teddy was born, lived in the garden house adjacent to the villa of an old lady Francine cleaned and did groceries for. In the old lady's fancy neighborhood, Teddy attended the local school. Being the only working-class child, with a mother who had 2 jobs and no husband, he didn't fit in. He wasn't bullied really, just ignored. Kids didn't find me interesting enough to bully, he told me. The only times he did get some attention, in the form of wide-open eyes and badly hidden chuckles, was when he ate pencils, which he did quite often. It landed him in the hospital twice for physical reasons. He loved it there, fussed over by warm-hearted children's ward nurses. When I met Teddy, he was about 50, single and pretty much friendless. A very sweet, soft-spoken man, extremely shy. He did like a chat in the hallway. When he felt so anxious or sad that he started to shiver, he ate cotton balls and an occasional pencil. The hard work of trying to get these unedible materials through his system gave him a sense of power, he said. Like one of those people in history whose task it was to try out food for kings. He got diagnosed with OCD at some point, but refused any type of psychological or psychiatric help, trusting nobody. One evening, when I came home from work, Teddy was lying in front of my door. He was unconscious. I could see vomit, blood, and lots of cotton balls in his mouth. I called 212, which is 911 in the Netherlands. The ambulance arrived quickly. That was the last time I saw Teddy, who survived this terrible ordeal. His half-sister, who I didn't know about, got him to move up north, where she lived. 2 years later, she sent me a short letter to inform me that Teddy had died by his own hand, as she put it. Whether cotton balls were involved, she didn't say. I tell this story because Rachel Aviv's incredible, profoundly smart, sensitive, and wise book brought back memories to Teddy. In Strangers to Ourselves, we are presented with the stories of 6 individuals, all who were diagnosed with mental illness at various points in their lives. But the stories are not just people with mental illness, but rather people who call into question their initial diagnosis and what happens when they do. There's Ray, a highly driven physician turned businessman who embodies the clash between psychoanalysis and psychopharmacology. There's Bapu, the Indian woman who stands on the fault/default line of mysticism and delusion after marriage into a hostile family. There's the deeply affecting story of Naomi, whose madness might well be a rational reaction to an unremittingly racist world. There's Laura, a Harvard-educated overachiever from Greenwich, Connecticut, whose illness occasionally offers her a break from the high expectations of her milieu and upbringing. And there's Hava, an anorexic girl turned woman who died in her 40s. The first story is Rachel's own. When she was 6 years old, she stopped eating. Pretty quickly, she was hospitalized with anorexia and put on a unit with anorexic girls, mostly in their teens. Hava was one of them. Rachel had never heard of the word anorexia. Basically, she had no context. What happened to her as a little girl who thought anorexia was maybe a dinosaur type she had missed, created a lingering question in her mind about possible mismatches between our own experiences of mental distress and the ways in which they get classified. For this book, she dove deep into this question and into the larger looming one. How do the ways that our mental distress gets qualified, and how do these qualifications themselves act on us? How do they change the course of our lives, our expectations for ourselves? As she writes in the book, there are stories that save us and stories that trap us. And in the midst of an illness, it can be very hard to know which is which. Like all of Rachel's reporting as a staff writer for The New Yorker, Strangers to Ourselves illuminates a murky corner of our world through an extraordinary mix of deep research, revealing detail, and engrossing storytelling. You finish her stories with a vastly deeper understanding of its subject, but troubled by what the story has uncovered. I am sure that if Rachel would write a story about Teddy, it would do him justice. Testament to the open, curious nature of her inquiries as a journalist and a writer, as well as to the abysmal complexity of the ways mental illness and unusual, sometimes destructive behavior plays out in people's lives. In Rachel's words, an interplay between biological, genetic, psychological, and environmental factors. That approach, with an extraordinary book to prove it, can guide us all to really see people and their unsettled minds. So let's now listen to Rachel as she reads a few pages from Strangers to Ourselves. Please welcome Rachel Aviv.
Thank you. I think that was the best introduction I've ever had. I really was kind of riveted. So I'm going to sort of pick up where you left off in terms of describing this strange experience of being 6 years old, and kind of randomly I stopped eating, and my mom took me to the pediatrician, and the pediatrician, this was the late 80s in Detroit, and anorexia was just a concept that was really in the air. And very quickly I was diagnosed with anorexia and put on this unit with much older girls. They were all teenagers. And I'll just read from the part where I'm sort of immersed in this new world, if I can find it. Sorry. On the anorexia unit, I was assigned a new roommate, Carrie, a 12-year-old with straw-colored hair. I asked her, "Do you think I'm weird?" so many times that she eventually said, "If you ask me one more time, I will say yes." She knew all the nurses on our floor and had become close with other patients. I viewed her and her friend Hava, who lived in the room next door to us, as mentors. Hava was 12 and beautiful, with sharp features and long brown hair that she didn't brush. There was something rugged and wild about her that reminded me of heroines of books about settling the American frontier. She kept a detailed journal of her hospital stay that was inflected by the therapeutic language through which she was learning to understand herself. A precocious student of her surroundings, she entered a rhapsodic mode after meeting me. "For God's sake, the girl's only 6, she wrote. Look at her. Let her trust an adult and release her childish behaviors hidden somewhere within that taut, stiff body. I bet she is just waiting for somebody to reach out their hand for her to clasp onto." Hava may have also been unduly influenced by the spirit of Yom Kippur. Earlier in the chapter, I describe how I first got the idea to fast from Yom Kippur, where I realized it was sort of possible to refuse food. She went to a Jewish day school and was terrified, she wrote in her journal, that she would not, quote, be written in the book of life, God's record of those who deserve to live another year. She blamed herself for, quote, not achieving a state of holy perfection. There were other similarities between us. Hava's parents were also involved in a prolonged and hostile divorce, and they too joked about obese family friends. They, quote, always made fun of the Ornsteins and called them the Oinksteins, she wrote. She had a friend like Elizabeth too. Elizabeth was this friend that I sort of wanted to become. When she played at the friend's house, she wrote in her journal, she liked to imagine that she lived there and would never go home. Her handwriting was so similar to mine that recently, when reading certain passages of Hava's journal, I became briefly disoriented and assumed I was reading my own words. When I met Hava, she had been hospitalized for nearly 5 months. Her mother, Gal, visited Hava's 6th grade class and tried to explain Hava's extended absence. Even though Hava's very thin, she told the class, she thinks she's very fat. Hava, who weighed 70 pounds, seemed conflicted about whether her mother's explanation improved her social status. In her journal, she listed what I wish I could like about myself, which included my personality, my intelligence, my grades, and my feelings. She had dreams in which she was, quote, pleading with my peers, and suddenly I received their total acceptance and understanding, she wrote. In the playroom, where everyone vied for one Pac-Man game, Hava befriended a 13-year-old who was pregnant with twins. When Hava complained about the strict eating rules on the anorexia unit, the pregnant girl's mother casually mentioned that Hava could burn off calories through exercise. She's the one who made up my mind that I'd do jumping jacks tonight, Hava wrote. I was in awe of Hava and Carrie's friendship, which solidified around mutual goals. Carrie and I compared our bones, skin, color, and thinness, Hava wrote. If Carrie weren't here, I don't know where I'd be. They seemed to go through cycles of weight loss and gain together. When they were on the upswing, the nurses let them visit the labor and delivery unit, where they gazed at the newborns. Some of the babies had, quote, needles and everything stuck in them, so it made me real thankful, Hava wrote. I just wish it could be easier to have a meal without the feeling of guilt. When the nurses weren't watching, Hava and Carrie paced the halls until Hava had trouble breathing. They also volunteered to distribute lunch trays to other patients. That was my exercise for the day, Hava wrote. I hadn't known that exercise had anything to do with body weight, but I began doing jumping jacks with Carrie and Hava at night. I no longer let myself sit down so as not to be a couch potato, a term they taught me. Nurses came to each room on the anorexia unit with a rolling cart of young adult novels. After I arrived, they began including books for younger readers, like the Berenstain Bears, the Clifford books, and the Mr. Men and Little Miss books, including Mr. Strong, a book about a man who ate 8 poached eggs for breakfast, a detail I found monstrous. I learned to read in my hospital room while sitting up. When nurses entered our room, I tried out my new skill by stringing together the 5 or 6 letters on their name tag. The older girls seemed to consider me a kind of mascot, an anorexic in training. My ideas about food and the body were even more magical than theirs. I would eat a bagel, but refuse a small bowl of Cheerios. One big O seemed preferable to 300 or so tiny O's. When Hava and Carrie let me watch them play Go Fish, I wanted to know, but was ashamed to ask, what sort of fish they were referring to. Fish in the ocean or cooked on a plate? I didn't understand that fish in the ocean became the type cooked on the plate, and if they meant the latter kind, I didn't want anything to do with the game. I think I'm gonna stop there and then just fast forward a little bit and describe, for a long time, this experience of anorexia felt like this weird aberration, like this sort of blip in my life, and I didn't really know how to make sense of it. Like I'd been told an interpretation by the doctors, by my parents, but like nothing quite felt sufficient, sort of legible to me. And so I'm just going to read a part where I kind of articulate the connection and the question that became the heart of the book for me. A few years ago, I went to Sweden to report a story about a condition known as resignation syndrome. Hundreds of children from former Soviet and Yugoslav states who had been denied asylum in Sweden had taken to their beds. They refused food. They stopped talking. Eventually, they seemed to lose the ability to move. Many had to be given feeding tubes. Some gradually slipped into states resembling comas. One child told me that during his months in bed, he'd felt as if he were in a glass box with fragile walls deep in the ocean. If he spoke or moved, it would create a vibration, which would cause the glass to shatter. The water would pour in and kill me, he said. Psychiatrists proposed that the condition was a reaction to both the stress of the migration proceedings and the trauma in the countries the children's families had fled. But they couldn't understand why the illness occurred only in Sweden, not in any neighboring Nordic countries where refugees from the same countries had resettled. As I interviewed families, I discovered that many of the children diagnosed with resignation syndrome had known someone who suffered from the disorder too. There were allegations in the Swedish press that the children were malingering, especially after Sweden established resignation syndrome as ground for granting residency. But when I met the children, I felt sure that they were not pretending. They took weeks, sometimes months, to emerge from a nearly catatonic state, even after their families had been told that they could stay in Sweden. What began as a protest seemed to take on its own momentum. The children had become martyr figures, a role that at first seemed freeing, but it began to destroy them. My conversations with families and doctors in Sweden made me reconsider my early experience with anorexia. Something about the mute, fasting children in Sweden felt familiar to me. For a child, solipsistic by nature, there are limits to the ways that despair can be communicated. Culture shapes the scripts that expressions of distress will follow. In both anorexia and resignation syndrome, children embody anger and a sense of powerlessness by refusing food, one of the few methods of protest available to them. Experts tell these children that they are behaving in a recognizable way that has a label. The children then make adjustments, conscious and unconscious, to the way they've been classified. Over time, a willed pattern of behavior becomes increasingly involuntary and ingrained. The philosopher Ian Hacking uses the term looping effect to describe the way that people get caught in self-fulfilling stories about illness. A new diagnosis can change the spaces of possibility for personhood, he writes. We make ourselves in our own scientific image of the kinds of people it is possible to be. In an essay about the children diagnosed with resignation syndrome in Sweden, Hacking refers to Pascal's wager. To avoid the possibility of eternal hell, we should behave as if God is real, even though we lack proof of his existence. Over time, we may internalize the faith we've been simulating. Our belief will become sincere. Hacking proposes that for some illnesses, a similar process is at work. We find a way to express our distress through imitation until, eventually, we have learned, or better, acquired a new psychic state. And I'll end there, and then we can talk. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Rachel. First of all, I was going to start with asking, how is it like for you to do journalism on your own past?
Is this working?
Is it working? No, I don't think
No.
so.
Yes? Yes, thank you. I think I approached my own childhood like it was an other person. And I think 6-year-olds are so other from adult selves anyway that it felt like an exotic creature, which was myself, and I was sort of reporting on myself in the same way that I would report on anything, like reading medical records, interviewing family members, interviewing doctors, interviewing other patients who were there at the same time. And then it was a breakthrough for me to realize the Hava had kept these journals so that I could sort of see my 6-year-old self through her 12-year-old eyes.
Yeah. How she wrote about you.
Right. It was like really shocking to see her sort of
patronizing, tender view of like what was the 6-year-old doing there.
Yeah, because when I was started reading your book, I was really impressed in the beginning. Like, wow, how does she still know so much from when she is 6? Because I don't know about you, but I have scattered memories of events from when I was that age.
You know, I think part of it is actually that I did write about it as like, in high school, I remember writing about it. It was an experience that I wrote about like as a young person, and so then you retain more memories than you would otherwise. And even when I wrote the chapter, I was able to like revisit my writing from that time that reminded me of things. And my mom had also kept a journal, so I had that. But then it was also such a weird experience that like there were things just imprinted in my memory. Like I don't remember the rest of first grade, but I remember those 6 weeks.
Yeah, you actually remember being there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because it was so new.
Yeah.
And maybe because I did the exercise of recalling it like in middle school and when it was still fresher, and then in high school when it was still fresh.
And do you remember feelings that you have when you were there? Did you remember homesickness? Were you scared?
I do remember being really homesick. I remember, like, what I really remember is admiring the older girls, like that, just sort of looking at them, wanting their approval. So I have a lot of, like, flashes of images of those older girls.
Yeah. And
which I think, like, speaks to why putting me in a hospital was not a good idea, because, like, I developed new, like, parental figures in that brief time, or I developed new people to sort of guide me.
yeah, which were anorexic girls.
Right.
Yeah. So could you say that you maybe, I mean, and then you sort of missed the boat, or as you said in the book, you didn't make a career out of it, but did you think that was actually, you were more of a risk to become anorexic while you were there?
Well, it's really hard to say because, like, in the end, the outcome was good. So it's hard to say they did something wrong, but I definitely think, I mean, for my parents, it was traumatic to have their child, like, taken away.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I was so young that when I came back to school, no one would use the word anorexic. It was just sort of like, Rachel's been sick and now she's back. And everyone, 6-year-olds are just so welcoming and so oblivious. And so I never had like a social identity as someone who had done, it just never like stuck to me as sort of an identity.
Did you had been an anorexic?
Right, that would have been meaningless.
Yeah.
It was sort of meaningless. And even I interviewed my teacher from that time, and she was like, yeah, I mean, I didn't use that word. Like, it didn't make sense to me.
Interesting. And what you write in the book that after your 6 weeks there, you were you could go because you had eaten enough. Your sister even told you that you were chubby because you ate so much there. Yeah. Probably because when you ate, you got to you were allowed to have contact.
It was my goal to get out at some point.
Oh, it was your goal to get out. Yeah, exactly. And then the doctors there advised your parents to keep you in psychiatric care. And they said no. And why and have you talked about to your parents about that? Because about that firm decision to not do it when they first were very firm in doing it.
Well, no, my parents weren't firm in putting me in the hospital. It
No.
was like they were just following other people's advice.
Okay. And then they were not after 6 weeks. They were.
I think my mom regretted it, but then at some point, like, I don't know what the Netherlands system is, but if you like pull out a child against medical orders, you could like face Child Protective Services, and it can be a whole thing. Wait, sorry, what was the...
Oh, so they advised your parents, the doctors advised your parents to keep her, and they said, no, we won't be doing that.
I think it's the same impulse that a lot of parents have, like, you want to mainstream your child. You don't want to put your child in a school for people with disabilities unless there's a really good reason to do so.
Yeah.
And my mom, I don't know, they had some sort of good impulse that would like stigmatize me, or that would sort of make me see myself as disabled. I think the school was called like School for the Emotionally Impaired, which is like Yeah. I mean, so you go to the school for the emotionally
That's quite a
impaired.
label, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you're like, I am emotionally impaired, and this is how I am, and I only associate with these people.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think my parents just had like a gut instinct that like, if we can, we'll keep her in her school.
Yeah, we keep her
Yeah.
out of the diagnosis, away from the label, actually, right? Or for any kind of mental illness label.
Yeah, I mean, I think I also like did go to a progressive school that allowed me like room. Like when I came back from the hospital, I only stood up. I had this weird idea about like not being a couch potato, therefore I need to stand up. And my teachers allowed me to, which I don't.
And did that still had to do with wanting to be thin, what you had learned from Hava and this
Yeah, something to do with that. I mean, I think
Yeah.
it was less about, I mean, I don't know, it could have been, but like it was more about this sense of being like industrious or I don't know, like not lazy, not lazy.
Yeah, yeah,
And to sit at your desk in first grade felt lazy.
yeah. So have you never considered writing about your past, about this part of your past before?
Well, I knew that it like provided a framework for like that because of this experience, I had like been led down a path of like intellectual curiosity about psychiatry, about explanations of mental illness.
Yeah.
But I really think it was that experience of going to Sweden and finally having like a lens through which to understand my experience and how it was relevant or sort of the aspect of it that felt universal, as opposed to it feeling so specific to like a particular cultural moment. Like there's a way of interpreting anorexia that I've always found like kind of boring. Like media consumption, the viewing of thin people, you want to be thin, society tells you. Like that's definitely
Basically always the same type of stories, right?
yeah.
About anorexia.
And that, I mean, it's not that that doesn't have truth.
No.
But I feel like it doesn't capture like a large part of the experience. One of the things, like when I was researching that chapter, that I was aware of was this thread of like fasting as mystical activity, in the sense that like when you don't eat, you're kind of training yourself for some like higher purpose. You feel like exalted, and there's a kind of high from starving oneself, and that I think that aspect of anorexia doesn't get thought about as much. Like there's something almost addictive about it.
Can you still feel that in your
Me?
current life? Yeah.
Oh no, I've never felt that.
No.
No.
Oh, no, you never did. No.
Yeah, no, I don't. I mean, maybe I did at the time, but I don't have a memory of that. No, what I observed was just reading memoirs of anorexia, reading Hava's journals, reading sort of academic papers about it. That like, there was a famous study of men in Minnesota. It was like a starvation study, and they were preparing for World War I, so they wanted to see like what happens to men's bodies when they starve. And they basically, like, starving produced many of the same symptoms as anorexia, in the sense of like obsessive preoccupation with food and this like sense of a high. So I was just interested in like the biology of starving and sort of how that becomes addictive in a way.
Yeah. So was the idea for the book, which you derived from had this lingering question, what I talked about in the intro, was that there first, and did you then look for the case studies, if I may call them?
Mm-hmm.
Do you call them case studies?
I first did, but then like stopped, because I realized that they weren't really case studies. They were sort of like family histories. They were so much about people's family and social communities. I think I had this like more vague idea for a book for much longer, and that had to do with talking to people and being aware of how hard it was for them to communicate the experience of being mentally ill, that like there was just this failure of language. And because there wasn't the language, the illness then gets translated into words that almost distort the experience. And so I had sort of been keeping my eye out. I had like the vague idea, and some of the people that or at least one of the people that I ended up writing about in the book, I'd met earlier on, and I kind of wanted, Bapu's daughter, I'd wanted to write a story about her for The New Yorker, but it almost felt like too much like this family saga of like, it just didn't fit in a timely story. And so she was one person. Other people I kind of like actively looked for. There was originally, the idea for the book was also spurred by this man.
Yeah.
No,
I think I read it somewhere.
Yeah. So I had originally written a story for Harper's in like 2012 maybe, about people in the earliest stages of psychosis. And they all were sort of complaining that like, there is no way to express what this feels like. And I wrote that story, and then this man emailed me and said, I thought I was the only one in the world who had this experience, and now I know there's like millions of people. And we just sort of started corresponding, and he was homeless, but had a PhD in philosophy. And the way that he described being homeless and sort of what it's like to go to soup kitchens, what it's like to sort of resist the homeless culture while, like just the sort of hierarchy of homelessness. I really wanted to write about him.
Yeah.
And so I talked to him for a year, but then he pulled out. But then I was already writing the book. So I sort of had to rethink. So there were a lot of people I was like talking to, considering, and it ended up being a combination of, how to tell a larger story. Like I wanted the stories I was telling to occur in an order where like the ideas, it feels like there's a kind of arc in the ideas that each story is expressing.
And did they all, that they had to keep a diary, was that for you? Did they have to have a diary for you to involve them?
No, but it just so happened. But it just, there was someone I wanted to write about, but there was like no paper record. So I was so dependent on his memory, and his memory just wasn't that good. So even though I wanted to write about him, I didn't. So I think it was more like, it was the people who had these like voluminous records of their experiences, whether it was letters they'd written or diaries or unpublished writings, that almost made it more practical to write about, because I could like access different parts of their experiences and not just rely purely on memory.
Yeah, so do you see a connection between mental illness and ferocious diary keeping?
No. The connection I see is between mental illness and an awareness that like language is really inadequate. But
there is
only
all
some
that
people
language,
who,
right? So they write and they write and they write and they speak and they speak. So there's so much language. So why is psychiatry then not equipped to take that language and do something constructive with which fits them?
It's kind of done the best, you have to generalize, and so it picks these symptoms, and there has to be like a very, it needs like a bureaucratic system for insurance and things, so it can't get too nuanced.
Yeah.
I don't know, but each person, it's not like, each person's description is wildly different too. Not always, but so I don't even know how you extract a language from that. Like every person's experience is so particular to like the content of their lives.
Yeah. Do you still keep a diary?
Like twice a year.
And when is that?
Like in moments of confusion or like peak anxiety.
Yeah, and does it help?
Not in the moment, but it is interesting to like look back and be like, it's more interesting historically, I think. Like I can look back and be like, oh, I was actually having like this same dynamic was playing out 10 years ago. I guess I really didn't change.
And do you then do it for like a period of time? So not like just one evening. It goes on for a couple of weeks?
I'll have like a moment, I'll write it, and then I'll be done. Now I'm mostly just like pasting insightful things that people text to me. Like.
Yeah, well, that's more practical maybe.
Right, quicker.
Yeah, quicker. So, as you also write about in the book, the truth of psychiatry as a science is changing moment to moment. Every generation has seems to have its own truth in psychiatry, with certain language, diagnosis, treatments to go with it. How did you feel challenged by that in the writing? That it's so fluent?
I mean, I think that's why it's so interesting to me, is like this field of science that like the truths are never quite stable, or like what you think is true 10 years later is like laughable, or not always, but just the sense of like the shifting ground and this swinging from one perspective to another perspective. And yet the like enthusiasm and belief in it. I mean, even like where we've come in like 10 years with the chemical imbalance theory, like, 10 years ago, that was what was wrong with people, a chemical imbalance. And now I think everyone's like, oh, no, that was a metaphor. Like that wasn't what was really happening.
No. That's interesting. And then, because every generation obviously thinks that they are telling the truth, right? That this is it.
Yeah. Right. But of course, we'll look back on like the way we talk about trauma today and be like, that was interesting. Like now we have like a entirely different perspective on it.
Yeah.
And I think that's why psychiatry is so interesting, because it is a science, but it's like the most subjective human science.
Yeah.
And so it's like so infused by culture.
Yeah. In every culture, there's probably a different.
It's an expression.
It has its own psychiatry.
Yeah.
It's an expression of yeah. So, and as a journalist, sometimes, I mean, I know maybe I feel like that, probably you too, sometimes not knowing where your story is going, what the heart, like what the core politically and socially of your story is, can be a form of anxiety for me. I mean, you dive into something like, I don't know where this. I mean, and is it then? Do you understand what I mean?
I think so. But so, are you saying, what do I do?
Well, and if your subject is so fluent and so subject,
fluid, kind of,
fluid, and then so subject to change. Is that? I mean, it's hard, or maybe it's even.
That makes it more interesting. I think if I was like, okay, my book is about how everyone needs to take medications, or my book is about the fact that it's mysterious is what makes it interesting to me, and what makes it feel like a place to spend time on, as opposed to, like sometimes I'll think about a story that's, this sounds like sad to say, but like person is wrongfully convicted. In America, like, the story, you know what happened, that the prosecutor used bad science, like if it's too clear cut, it's a worthwhile story, but it like doesn't have that sense of mystery, and sort of, I don't feel as intellectually like engaged. Even though it's socially so important that you tell that story. Well, but like now, I mean, this is getting into a different topic, but I think now it's hard to tell those stories. Yeah. Because of, the media wants a certain kind of story, and it needs to be a level of unfamiliar. And those stories have become so familiar. Yeah, and psychiatry is more of an ocean where we know like this much about yet. Yeah, I mean, wrongful convictions was a bad example, because it's just like totally different. Yeah. But I think. But a lot of people are doing it. When you're like, this is the villain, this evil prosecutor, and that feels straightforward in a way where it's like, you know what, let the lawyers do their job. Like, it's a human rights report. Like, not that. I want to figure out what I'm doing that a lawyer couldn't do. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I understand. So you have done a tremendous amount of research of the history of psychiatry in the U.S., in the world. So what is your impression of the profession, the psychiatric profession in America at the moment? What is currently accepted as truth? Well, I may have a skewed sense now, because I hear from like only the psychiatrists who've read my book, and therefore are like really into like the idea. They say you are right. Right. But I think psychiatry is just limited by like economics in a way. Like, it doesn't matter how lofty the ideas are when they're institutionalized in a sort of mass way. It ends up that a patient has 10 minutes. And so like, of course, you're not going to know anything about the patient's culture or life or desires or what recovery looks like for that person. It's just like an economic impossibility.
And also with insurance and yeah.
Yeah.
So, but they still want to help that person, right? So how do psychiatrists work with that? I mean,
It just varies so much. Like a $400 psychiatrist in the Upper West Side in Manhattan
yeah.
is different from the psychiatrist you meet in the ER when you're having like a psychotic episode. I think it's hard to speak about the state of psychiatry because I think like psychiatry wants to do a lot of things and like can't because it's so limited by the healthcare insurance system.
And are sometimes, you think, pills prescribed because they know they only have this 10 minutes? And
Yeah. They want, the person made, especially someone like in a rural area, they like waited for this appointment, they come 2 hours, and like the psychiatrist wants to give them something for their efforts and like to help to sort of ease whatever pain they're in, and like that's all they can do. So it's like triage all the time.
Yeah, because I think there's a move in psychiatry in the US, maybe also here in Europe, to call serious mental illness a brain disease.
Oh,
Does that have to do with that? Like, if you call it a disease, you can prescribe a pill because it's sort of linked together.
I almost see that as like very 2015. Like,
oh, really?
Like brain. I feel like we're slightly over the hump of that. Like, yes, it was called a brain disease. There was this idea of like destigmatizing mental illness by pretending that it's exactly the same as any physical illness. And I think there is a lot of that, but I think less than there was a couple years ago. Like there's more of a sense of like social factors and not. I mean, it's hard to speak in general, but I saw more of that like brain disease language a couple years ago than I do now.
Yeah. Interesting, eh? How that's sort of, and now that's out, and now there's something.
I think now like there is an ideal of a more holistic way of seeing the mind.
Yeah.
It's just that the ideal like only is pursued in very elite contexts.
Yeah. And that brings me to the subject of loneliness, where I want to talk about, because you also addressed it as a concept that has not been incorporated in psychiatry that much, and never has been, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
Do you recognize it in the people you because I think it's a huge thing, loneliness, in terms of psychiatry. Do you recognize it in the people you write about?
When I was interviewing that man who had the PhD in philosophy with schizophrenia and was homeless, I remember asking him, like, is there any book you've read that sort of captures your experience best? And he recommended The Lonely City by Olivia Lang, which is like about a woman's loneliness as she navigates New York City. And I was really surprised. Like that's not about mental illness at all. It's certainly not about homelessness, but it's about sort of the emptiness and aimlessness and sort of deep isolation of like being in a city without anyone. And in one of the chapters, I write about this psychiatrist Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, and she has this really beautiful essay called On Loneliness, and she essentially argues that like, psychiatrists are scared themselves of loneliness. Like it's such a haunting subject that they're almost afraid that if they ask their patients about it, they'll be like contaminated by it. Like it's just like naked, raw existence, and that psychiatry really hasn't engaged with the idea of loneliness. And then I really felt like when I was thinking about the determining factors in the lives of the people I wrote about, like when they recovered, it was because someone had punctured their loneliness, whether it was like...
Really?
I mean, that played a huge role, like whether it was finding a community of like-minded people or a boyfriend, sad to say, like that, like finding someone who loved them,
Yeah,
or
like the librarian in the prison where Naomi.
or a librarian sort of reading the same books as you. Yeah, someone who just sort of sees you on multiple levels, like whether it's your taste in literature, sort of your taste in, I don't know, it just felt like there was like a puncturing of the isolation, and that really influenced people's ability to recover.
And why do you think, if it's so clearly a huge issue which can be punctured, why do you think it's not more, it doesn't play more of a role in this search for the truth, what psychiatry still is?
Well, because it's like
Because they're
probably
scared of
it doesn't
it.
require a medical degree to be like, you need a friend. So it is more of I mean, there are some tasks that psychiatry are sort of outside the purview, but I think there are like these peer support networks, like people who have all had the same illness sort of coming together, like clubhouses, things like that. There are ways in which more like social workers will construct programs to help people feel less alone.
Yeah. And getting a diagnosis also makes people feel less alone.
Yeah, I think that can be an effect. I think that's the confusing thing, is like sometimes it really can make you feel less alone and give you access to medication that works and help you feel like this isn't your fault, or help your family feel that way. And then it's hard to predict. And then sometimes the diagnosis can feel limiting and can feel like you're sort of being told that your life is going to go a certain way, and that you're being told that you don't have the potential that you thought you had. And I think that feels really hard, that like both of those things are true, and it's very hard to know when it's going to be one or the other.
And I can imagine that can also make you sort of like annoyed or angry. Do you think, okay, I felt really lonely and nobody sort of helped me with that, and now I need this diagnosis.
Yeah.
And I need a diagnosis because I feel lonely, and then this diagnosis makes me feel less lonely, while it's actually there's a problem before that about loneliness. Or maybe I'm just sort of like
Yeah, I mean, I think loneliness like exacerbates any mental illness, and it also sort of makes you less in touch with reality, because you don't have people to like check your experience against.
Yeah. Yesterday I listened to an episode of This American Life.
Oh yeah.
The rest of the story, and you are in there in an episode about
Incidents, or you?
No. Or maybe it was no, it wasn't. Probably not. I think I listened to it before when it was a coincidence, and then I thought about it yesterday. Like, hey, that was she was there, and because you were a guest on that show to talk about Ray, and Ray Asheroff, the businessman, physician who starts a lawsuit against the institution that tries to help him first. But what I also found, because the episode of This American Life is called The Rest of the Story, like what happens next, and what I thought was interesting, that after all the different forms of therapy that Ray had, some unsuccessful, others a little more successful, people around him, like his son, still experienced him as a very difficult person, too difficult to live with. And even you as a writer struggled with him most in the book, right?
Yes, yeah.
Also because you thought he was annoying.
Yeah. I think that he had a mental illness, but I also think he had what one might call like a really difficult personality, and that's different than mental illness. And the doctors were treating the mental illness, and it felt like, so he started at Chestnut Lodge, which was really focused on psychoanalysis, and they felt like the only way he could be cured is if he sort of restructured his personality, which it sounds absurd and kind of is absurd. And so he switched to a different hospital that gave him medication, and he's recovered quite quickly. But he still had the same personality, and that was a personality that really alienated people and that made him quite alone. and he still had these sort of obsessive tendencies that maybe the medications never did treat. But yeah, I basically felt like his case became this famous case about the collision between biology and psychoanalysis, biological psychiatry and psychoanalysis, and neither one could really help him. And what he needed was some sense, like he felt so aggrieved. It was like he was holding on to his rage and resentment, and it didn't quite feel like he was looking in the right places, and it felt hard because I don't know that psychiatry is the place.
No, exactly, because I find it fascinating, the concept of difficult people, because I think we all, if we take a short pause here, like 30 seconds, and to think about annoying, difficult people in our lives, we all be like, 1, 2, 3. You know? But, and I say it a bit callous now, but difficult is not the same as mad, as you just said. And yet, people with mental illness are often quite difficult as well.
I mean, there's a way that mental illness also interacts with one's personality. So
Yeah.
I have a friend who, or not really a friend, but friend of a friend, who had a manic episode that it was harder to have sympathy for than someone else, for her friends, because the manic episode kind of really coincided with a lot of her, like, the frustrating things about herself are sort of exacerbated. I don't really know, I mean...
Can you make it more concrete?
It was someone who was attention-seeking.
Okay.
Sort of self-exposing in a certain way, and then the mania amped up that self-exposing, attention-seeking behavior. Although I guess you could, of course, say maybe originally it was mania, but it sort of manifested in a certain way where when she hurt people in that manic episode, it was hard for people to forgive her as easily because it felt like so much an outgrowth of things she did when she was not manic.
Yeah. Very difficult, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, but yeah. It doesn't make it any like less painful for her to have done those things.
No.
Yeah.
So I want to go to the pandemic for a little bit, and then I'm going to bring in Lena soon. But first I want to ask you, you wrote the book largely during the pandemic years, I think?
Yeah.
So how did that feel?
Well, I had my book leave from the New Yorker. I'm trying
to write the book.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think I can't remember when it started. I think it was before. I think it was like fall of 2019 to fall 2020. So yeah, it did coincide.
Did it influence it at all?
It influenced some of the reporting. Like I had to wait. I really wanted to interview Naomi, who was in Minnesota earlier, but I knew she didn't really care about COVID. And I was sort of embarrassed to be like, could you test before? So so then as soon as I saw on Facebook that she got COVID, and I was like, finally I can go. So I went the next week.
Oh. Okay, before we can continue about the mental health crisis that the pandemic sparked or eliminated, I would like to invite Lena Bril to join us. She's a journalist who writes a lot about the interaction between social media and mental health. Mijn rechterorbel? Oh, ja. Sorry hoor, jongens. Okay. Hi, Lena.
Hi.
So, in the first year, this is from the WHO, the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, global prevalence of anxiety and depression increased by a massive 25%, they write on their website. Women and young people were and are affected the most. Lena, when we got together last week to talk about tonight, you spoke about what you call the frame that there is a mental health crisis. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, that's a hard question. Well, I think by calling it a mental health crisis, you're sort of medicalizing all these feelings people are having. And I'm not saying that those feelings aren't really hard or are harder than before, but yeah, I have problems with that frame, calling it a mental health crisis.
You too?
What, did you say you too?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
I'm nodding because I think there's a way in which calling it mental health crisis takes the burden off a lot of other like social institutions that might help people, like an economic crisis. I don't know, did you read, there was a really good article in the New York Times, like taking issue with the idea of calling it a mental health crisis.
Was it from David Brooks?
No.
I think it was about therapy speak. No, I haven't read it. Yeah, it focused really on the self and on the inner experience and not on the social causes or climate change or all those other.
So it puts blame on the people. Is that what you mean?
Not necessarily blame.
It like localizes the problem in the self as opposed to in the society.
Yeah. And of course, everyone is looking for causes in society, but I don't like the medicalization of it. And also with the pandemic, like I think a lot of the statistics show that those feelings and suicide rates already were going up before the pandemic.
Yeah.
It just accelerated it.
Yeah, and now they are, even in the Netherlands, they are super high amongst, and now it's the leading cause of death for people between 20 and 30, I think.
Oh,
and it has never, I think, as far as I know, never been like that before here.
Yeah, that sounds really disturbing. Also with suicide, you always have the risk that if people read a lot about suicide, that that it becomes an option to.
Yeah,
practice.
but maybe the word crisis sort of has also an effect that people are sort of resigning into it, like.
Well, also you get really scared, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh my God, there's a mental health crisis. It makes me really suspicious on my own mental health and of others, and it's a way of speaking, and you hear a lot of therapy speak, especially on social media, and I'm afraid it's not necessarily an intimate language or a language you connect with your friends to talk in mental health.
Because you have also written beautifully about your preoccupation with social media, especially YouTube, I think.
Yeah, I wrote a story about TikTok that was during the pandemic. So I'm really interested in the stories, especially shaped by new media, such as social media, and the interaction with how you perceive yourself and your psyche.
Can you tell a little bit about what happened to you?
Yeah, so I didn't grow up with a smartphone. I think I got my first when I was 19, and I really remembered that when I first moved out of my family home, so I was living alone for the first time, and there were these girls on YouTube taping themselves every day, so vlogging. And I felt lost. I had quite a common student experience of feeling lonely and not really sure who you are. And those girls were there every day on YouTube telling me how to live, what they ate, how they exercised. And at some point, I just started mimicking them. They also felt sort of like friends, and also really safe friends, because they couldn't hurt me because they were on the screen. And so that never really, I never really developed anorexia or went to a clinic or something like that. But it was something I got quite obsessed about. And then 6 years later, there was this pandemic, and everyone was talking about a new upcoming platform, TikTok. And people were mostly talking about this crazy algorithm that was so good at figuring out what you're interested in, that people were saying that it knew you're better than your therapist. And at that point, I actually was a social media strategist, so I knew a lot about the influence of social media, and I knew a lot about how these algorithm works, and also because of my experience with those YouTube girls, I knew what kind of impact it could have on my body image and my behavior. but I thought, I have to try. And I think, I saw a lot of weird videos, just people baking stuff and making potteries and just doing stupid things. And at some point, there was this girl with, I think, a bowl of food. And I think I just kept watching that video a little longer than other videos. And within 50 minutes, I was just seeing girls with severe anorexia. So that were these girls mostly telling about recovering from anorexia, and a lot of them were also making content from a hospital. So a lot of girls with tubes in, and it felt, I was really torn. Like on the one hand, I was repelled, and it's so shocking to see. And on the other hand, I recognized something of myself, and there was this pandemic, and there was almost no structure in life. And I don't know, these girls gave me some kind of structure and something I recognized from myself, like the obsessive controlling your food and counting. And I noticed within days the effects on my thoughts, on my body image. Like I was looking at certain body parts again that I hadn't done in years, and looking at food labels. So I'm really, like, in the discussion about mental health, and a lot of people say social media causes it, and I'm not really sure, but
it's almost like a diagnosis, right? That you are getting from...
Yeah, and also like a peers.
And also,
you find a
from your
community
peers,
of girls who are also feeling, they're mostly girls, who are also feeling lonely, and they're also, I dive into it, like there are huge comment sections of girls trying to recover and also really helping to try to recover, but it becomes a group you belong to, and if you feel lonely, that's something that's appealing, I think. And especially during the pandemic, if you're not able to see your friends, then that's, something, but...
It sounds like that the online space is basically functioning like like in real life space that it's exposed to.
Yeah, and also TikTok works a lot like we call in Dutch piekeren. That's like a really repetitive thought. Like you're just seeing the same and the same and the same, and nothing else comes along because TikTok just wants to keep you on that platform. And it works like the illness itself, like it's a repetition of the same images and thoughts. And I think that's not only with videos on eating disorders, that's also with videos explaining about your dad is a narcissist, or you have an ADHD, or you're neurodiverse. Like once you're in that rabbit hole, it's just a repetition of the same. And
how does this therapy speak? Would you have a piece coming out? Short, right? About how does that fit into that? Because this almost has an erosion of these words. Yeah,
I think you see, like the language of the professional is democratized, and especially since Me Too, I think people use a lot of words like boundaries and narcissism is one you see a lot. I'm not sure. I think it has the same function as those girls with eating disorders. Like on the one hand, you sort of feel special when you identify as being, for example, you have an emotional abusive parent. Like you feel sort of special that you have that specific story. But then on the other hand, there are so many people with that experience. And that therapies speak... it really shows that on TikTok. Like everyone's thinking, oh, I'm so special. I was grown up with a mother who's a narcissist. But then on the other hand, there are like 6 billion videos about it.
Yeah.
So I think it's a language trying to connect with each other. And I'm not sure if it's really succeeding. Like if I talk with my friends in terms of trauma and boundaries, I'm not really sure if I see my friends or get to know my friends better. But I think it's an attempt. the therapy speak.
Yeah, yeah. I read a piece by a psychiatrist. I forgot his name, and he was talking about therapy speak online, and he said the language of the smartphone and about the kids who are spending a lot of time on it. They all use the same words, and still they do not really connect.
Yeah,
Is what he said.
yeah, it's hollow.
Have you ever written about this subject?
I guess I feel like my book was a little bit about it.
Yeah, because your book is also about language, right? About
How certain words like obscure understanding more than opening things up.
yeah,
Like, the answer is I have a narcissistic father, end of story.
yeah,
That's like quite generic. Yeah, there's a way in which like that like puts a stop to inquiry because you have like your neat explanation or your neat label.
yeah, and therefore it's sort of it isolates you more than it makes you connect with whatever's going on.
It can also free you, right? Like if you have an addiction, it can really free you to know, okay, I have this addiction, so I cannot drink ever again. So then such a label can really help, and the same is for a narcissistic parent. But I think a lot of people, yeah, maybe it especially on TikTok, it's almost like a shortcut to discover different stories.
Yeah. I want to talk about one more thing before we take questions from the audience. 5 of the 6 people in your book are women. Mm-hmm. I might be stating the obvious when I say this could not be a coincidence, or is it?
Well, it's not that I wanted it to be so woman heavy.
No.
It's that I like women. I don't know, like I...
Yeah, no, but they've been labeled as hysteric since the Stone Age. So...
I think I did wish it were a little bit more...
But you couldn't get around
But I
them.
ended up, the people that I ended up sort of wanting to write about because of many different factors just happened to be women. And so I just sort of settled for that unevenness.
Yeah.
But it wasn't because women, I know that like women are, like white women in America are medicated a lot more in terms of antidepressants than other populations. Like there are demographic differences, but I wasn't necessarily reflecting them. It was more serendipitous.
Yeah, so it's not...
Like the fact that the man who I was going to write about dropped out, just stuff like that.
But even if we take it away from your book, which is for you, I can totally see that you were, that it's not on purpose. But in general, as you say, women are more medicalized mentally than men. And there probably is a sort of stereotyping going on. Would you say that can muddle the waters in the search for psychiatry in like everyday practice of diagnosis and
Wait, sorry.
yeah, if you would think that there is a sort of stereotyping going on in and a difference being made between men and women when they get to be or not get to be diagnosed with mental illness. In this truth searching, you might want to be aware of a certain kind of misogyny going on.
I think there's so many different, class is a huge issue in terms of the way that psychiatrists are, what they're expecting from people. Race is a huge issue. The gender stuff, I think what I noticed was like a certain type of woman, not just women, but like a certain type of woman experiences a certain type of anxiety was far more likely to like go to a psychiatrist and also sort of be prescribed.
Like yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And you write about it, I think, really candidly and funnily as well, about you and your friends all taking antidepressants. And but you also write, you don't say it so pointedly, but that this is, it feels like this is a women thing.
Antidepressants specifically.
Yeah. A white certain type of women thing.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I wanted to narrow it down to white
Okay,
women and not
yeah.
just.
Sorry.
Yeah. No. I mean, it felt like a cultural phenomenon, like women who were facing similar struggles, which had to do with like conflicting impulses, ambition, strength, shame for that ambition or strength. Sort of feeling a lot of like friction and taking medications and then not being sure if they ever had a medical problem or if they're sort of taking a medication that allows them to fulfill the role they want to fulfill in society better. And then questions about like, does it matter if they had a medical problem or not, if it's making them move through the world more easily.
You don't have to even see a psychiatrist.
Right, yeah. It just felt like it can't be possible that all of us are suffering from this particular same illness, like something is going on here.
Yeah. Yeah, and is it, because you talk about it very candidly and also about the way you talk about it amongst each other, is it so normal in America to talk about, so open about taking pills? Because in the Netherlands, I think we are open about different things. We are open about euthanasia, abortion, stuff like that. No, but I mean, not about, I have no idea
We're
which
open about abortion too, I would say, but not euthanasia.
Well, I don't have, besides from my really, really, really close friends, I have no idea who is from like in my larger group. I don't know who is on medication for a mental.
I think people are pretty open about it. At least the people I know, like it's not felt like it's something secret. It's like like I would be more surprised if someone had never tried an antidepressant at this point.
And do you still take them?
Yeah, the same. It's basically I'm in the same state as I was when I wrote the book.
Yeah. And have you ever given it thought about how the book would have turned out if you weren't?
I just have no idea. Like at this point, it's been so long that I don't actually know what my other self would be and whether it would be vastly different or not. I don't think it would be that different because I feel like probably the medication actually affects me less and less. Just to some degree, maybe I'm like avoiding the experience of going off because that feels scary, but I don't necessarily like know how much I'm feeling the effects of it. It's hard to know. You grow up and you like become more confident in certain areas of life and you don't know if you wouldn't have needed the I don't know, it's just all muddled.
Yeah. Also a form of self-diagnosis or, you know, it's sort of...
It's a space of security. Like,
yeah.
I feel bad I could just like increase my dosage, but it's all kind of magical thinking anyway.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We'll take some questions from the audience. Mieke is there with the, yeah.
I'm going to break the rule of asking a question because I don't think I have a particular question. I just want to say thank you. I've struggled with mental illness since I have memory, and I could identify with every single one of the characters up to a certain extent. So I want to say thank you for putting that out there. I have to admit this conversation has been extremely frustrating for me to hear.
Why was it frustrating?
It's frustrating because it's not only about the stories that you tell about yourself, that, you know, the shifting identity. When they changed my diagnosis, it's like my world kind of, yeah. Right, it all went sideways. But I have to say that it has been really frustrating because it's not only about the way I see myself, but about the way other people without mental illness see me. And I don't know, some of the questions that you were asking, I'm sure were well-intentioned, but you said something like, why isn't it solvable by getting a friend? And, well, you don't feel worthy, you feel scared to connect. It's just a lot harder. And questions about psychiatry and things like that, that the way that other people see you, they're so foreign. I have these times sometimes when I feel like it gets disconnected. The way that I connected with those characters was really, really huge, whereas the way that I did not connect with the questions that you were asking, which I imagine is what most people would want to know, if they read the book. I guess that's what they would ask. So I just felt a huge, I'm not criticizing you, by the way, I'm just saying
No,
I felt...
it's fine. It's plus that you felt that the book gave you so much solace, right?
It wasn't really solace. I think it didn't give me any solace because everything goes to shit. There's really kind of no hope there. For even Hava, I really hoped Hava would, finally, and then this thing. But anyway, sorry for the spoiler alert. I don't want to monopolize the whole conversation. I just want to say getting help here is also really, really difficult. I do think there is a big mental health crisis, and I'm not necessarily talking about the people coping with anxiety and depression, which is, terrible in its own right, but these people that are dealing with schizophrenia that don't have access in the rural areas. So I think if you call it a mental health crisis, then maybe the resources can get there. But that's all I have to say.
Thank you. More questions?
It's very interesting. You spoke briefly about the reactions you got from mental healthcare workers, psychiatrists, and clinical psychologists. Was there a pattern in their reactions? Because I think the things you write about, they struggle with the same questions in their profession. So was there a pattern in their reactions? And
was there a what?
A pattern.
A pattern.
Pattern in reactions from professional healthcare mental workers. Or criticism or applause or...
Yeah. Obviously it's a very biased sample size because it's the people who decided to read my book and then the people who felt strongly enough that they wanted to write me. I think there is a movement within medicine to think more about the role of storytelling. I don't know if there's this movement here, but there's this narrative medicine movement in America where doctors are being encouraged to study literature and to work on their own writing with this idea that the act of telling a story and becoming readers of stories will make them more empathetic as clinicians. So I did hear from a lot of people kind of engaged in that world who wanted to think about how to help become better storytellers in medicine and better story listeners. I guess that was the one pattern. And then there would be social workers, psychologists who sort of felt slightly oppressed by psychiatrists and felt the book was sort of useful in showing the importance of the work that they do and not acting as if psychiatry is the only one that has the answer. Who's calling?
Yeah, I have a question. I have several family members, friends that are dealing with other chronic illnesses that can't seem to get their healthcare workers to deal with the mental health illnesses that have gone along with chronic illnesses, Parkinson's and all this. So is there some buzzwords that they should tell their normal care workers that they need help? Is there some...
Have they tried depression?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's really hard because I think chronic illness often gets, first I hear almost the opposite story often is that people with chronic illnesses are frustrated because they're being treated like psychiatric patients. So in a way that's good. But it does seem just sort of self-diagnosing and then saying that this is what they need help for might be a direct path. I don't know though. Yeah.
Hey, Rachel. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go first.
Thanks. Just want to say thank you, of course, for coming, and I wanted to mirror some of the other questions that were said. I really appreciated, just people sharing their personal stories. I have kind of a comment and a question first.
Can you speak closer to the mic?
Yeah, of course. Is that better? I'm a linguistics student, and a lot of this brought to mind the conversation, the therapy speech, and how language and power is so related and intertwined in this conversation. And it just brought to mind the fact that so much of the therapy speech is dominated and manipulated by people that were disenfranchised or marginalized communities, young people, people of color, and how that can be so frustrating for some people in this industry because all of a sudden it's something that's so out of their control, Like here's a community that's all of a sudden reclaiming the speech that defines their story, and that all of a sudden feels really disempowering to everyone else that used to be in a position of power in health and medicine. So that was just a thought I had when I was listening. I wanted also to speak to some of the cultural conversation that you were having about this, because so much of this is cultural, how we talk about health. And I grew up in the US, but have family all over the world and spend a lot of time with family in Western Europe. And the relationship that they have to health and health treatment is so vastly different. And I find, a lot of my family here makes fun of me for even taking vitamins. Like, why would you take vitamins if it's in your food? Or just surprised by any trip to the doctor, And so I just wanted to hear, it seems to me like there's some sort of socially related health superiority complex in Western Europe that they simply need less help. And even in listening to the conversation and hearing you say, oh, suicide rates have gone up even in the Netherlands, So I just wanted to hear a little bit of what you had to say about cultural health and how you've observed that in Sweden. I'm Swedish, so what you saw in Sweden concerning that. So anyway.
I don't know what I'm about to say, so maybe I shouldn't say it, but I did write a story about euthanasia in Belgium, which I found really fascinating because the way that people talked about, because I was writing specifically about people who got euthanasia for psychiatric illnesses, and I was very struck by the idea, and I don't know if this is even consistent with like the stereotypes, but the idea that a doctor could declare a psychiatric illness incurable, that like there could ever be that level of knowledge, that like there could be a declaration that this person is not going to get better. That was very striking to me. I think, and obviously there are cases where that's completely true, but that was like a level of boldness, and it did feel like a little bit more patriarchal. I mean, like sort of that a doctor could look at a life and not know that life that well and say like, this person is never going to be happy again. Like that was an interesting dynamic that I spent time thinking about. Sort of, it did feel like a huge cultural difference. Like the U.S. goes way too far in the other direction. Well, not to say that it's too far, but like, like making people like cling to life in the most like dismal sorts of ways.
I wanted to ask a question going back to Ray, specifically about any insights you have perhaps on the relationship between personality and pathology, because I found it quite interesting that it was sort of an obnoxious case in itself because of that distinction. And I'm wondering if there is a sort of separate existence for personality at all in the context of mental health, what your insights were from your research. And then secondarily, of course, with that, I'd be super interested to hear about your personal idea of pathology in the context of mental health.
I mean, there's this whole category of personality disorders which is like this gray area because personality disorders are not easy to treat. Like they're often really difficult to treat, and the obvious thought would be maybe they're so difficult to treat because like they're personalities, they're not illness. And I think with Ray, another problem is like people with difficult personalities like Ray, I think muddy their psychiatric care with their, like just as I found Ray annoying when I wrote about him, so too did his doctors feel sort of repelled by him, and for that reason probably did not provide the best treatment and care for him. Like, he actually wasn't getting good care from these doctors who were supposed to be really listening and thinking about his life. I don't remember the second half of the question, but I remember it was hard.
Pathological in itself, and then what would
What is
pathological
pathology?
be? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't
Just to
really
you
have a
personally.
definition, and I don't really think about it in terms of pathology. I think about it more in terms of like disability, like what is causing someone to be unable to participate in life in the ways that they want to, like whether there's someone who's always wanted a family or someone who has a job that they love, like if their symptoms are interfering with their ability to do those things, that to me is like mental illness or mental disability. I guess I don't really define pathology because that feels just sort of too subjective.
Yeah. Can I talk? Yeah. Yes, I wonder if we don't speak about mental illnesses a little too much, and if it isn't a society that the bar is too high to fit the norm of what is considered normalcy, and that a lot of people are just very intolerant of people who are a little different. And so I don't know, maybe people can benefit from it to call something a mental illness because you can get insurance and you can get medication. But I also find sometimes, today's society very harsh and the bar is very high and a lot of people are left out. So then I think, maybe there's something wrong with the system and not something wrong with, people who are considered having a mental condition.
I mean, I thought about this a lot when I was writing the chapter about Bapu, with this woman living in India who kind of thought of herself as a sort of communicating with the divine, and she took on this reputation as being a mystic. And her daughter, Bapu's daughter, really struggled with this. Like, is my mother writing this divine poetry? She has this gift. Like, why are we trying to give her medication? And then her daughter described seeing her. She came to visit her at a healing temple, and her mother was, like emaciated. She had like sores on her body. She was very alone, and she said, like, my mother is this radiant being who has this divine connection, and that is true, but it's also true that she's starving and she's sick and she's like in pain, and that is true too. And I think there's a way in which you can get like too carried away by its society. It's not the, like if you, it's a social construction, and then you're sort of confronted by like the hard reality of like the suffering of someone on the street, and to deny that that's illness can feel like sort of not seen too. So I find that a very beautiful idea that has a lot of merit, but I feel like there's a way in which, in the 70s in America, anti-psychiatry was a really huge movement, and these like wonderful thinkers were proposing that mental illness doesn't really exist, but it was almost like a convenient way of saying mental illness doesn't exist, therefore we don't have to deal with the problem of mental illness. So I think to do that can be sort of evading like the reality of real suffering too.
Yeah, but it's so stigmatizing sometimes, and sometimes I think it's just a coping mechanism to trauma. Complex trauma is now sort of an issue. All about PTSD, but now complex PTSD is now more being talked about, which I think is actually a really good thing. So sometimes I think psychobabble, psychotalk can be a really good starter to be against the taboo.
We're gonna go to the. Sorry, we have 2 more questions to go.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks so much for being here and for this really in-depth conversation. You touched on a few different themes, including mysticism and the power of fasting from an addictive perspective, and on self-diagnosis. How do you think this trend in microdosing and how this kind of feeds into psychiatry and medicine? Do you have a perspective on that?
I can say that my husband's like #1 goal is to switch me to microdosing. No, he just thinks it would make me like a more fun person. I don't actually, and maybe because of that, I don't have that many thoughts about microdosing. I just know that it seems just as legitimate as like any other thing, you know. But then there's this thing of it's the newest fad, and we should always be suspicious of the newest fad because we know the benefits and we don't know, you know, the downsides. So I'm skeptically interested.
And the final question is for you.
Rachel, thank you so much for having the courage and the bravery to write this book and to share your story. What's the one thing you wish the world would better understand about mental health?
That's a hard question.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think like knowing someone that you love with a mental illness will change your perspective on mental illness. I just think like familiarity. So I can't really extract one thing except that like to love and care about someone and reading about them is like a poor proxy for that, but it like does do some of that like to sort of not, you know, there was a way when you were telling your story about your neighbor was,
yeah, Teddy.
You know, you could sort of like recoil or you could feel tender, and you sort of felt tender, and I think it's like that feeling of compassion, and so, as opposed to let's distance oneself because we don't want to be contaminated somehow.
Well, that's a beautiful last sentence, I think. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you all for this wonderful conversation, such an intense evening. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Els. Thank you, Lena. Thank you, Wolters Kluwer. And thank you, our audience, for joining us. Els wrote a beautiful introduction, which will be on our website tomorrow. I'm going to read it again. I thought it was really a wonderful story. Thank you for that, Els. Before we go to the book signing, just a quick word about what's upcoming at the John Adams. Margot Jefferson on October 4th, Kim Stanley Robinson on November 8th on his book The Ministry of the Future, one of Obama's favorites of 2022. And on November 24th, Walter Isaacson on his biography of Elon Musk. But I'm sorry to say it's sold out already. I know. Thank you all for joining us, and see you outside for drinks and the book signing.